name's Mike Hartington. I work for the Ionic team. If you've ever used Ionic before, you probably have seen my face. I'm sorry. If you have any questions at any point and you can't find me, I love hallway talks. But if you can't find me, feel free to reach out online. I would love to hear any of your comments, questions, or concerns about any of this stuff. So this talk's called The Rise of Web Components. I like to think of this as a second talk. I've been watching a lot of old movies. Recently, I watched Dr. Strangelove again. How I learned to stop worrying and love the web again. If anyone catches the reference. If not, oh well. So we're going to take a quick history lesson first to kind of understand why web components are a thing. Let's look at where we at Ionic came from. So roughly around 2013, Ionic was still just an idea, kind of born out of a couple drunken nights in a log cabin, which is not a joke. That's actually how it was done. We just felt very frustrated with a lot of the tool sets at the time. So if you're thinking about the JavaScript frameworks, the CSS frameworks back at the time, back in 2013, they really weren't that good. Most of them were focused on desktop kind of responsive websites. And even then, the responsive part was kind of an afterthought. So you had all this CSS code base that was targeting IE 6, 7, 8, 9, all these older browsers. And then it's like, oh, we need to make responsive sites. Quick, throw some CSS queries, media queries in there, and hope everything just works. So it ended up being very slow and very not performant. And then the JavaScript frameworks at the time, I tried to find actually a dumpster emoji. There is no dumpster emoji. So yeah, it was a dumpster fire. JavaScript at the time was very lost, and frameworks were either, again, not focused so much on a mobile as far as performance goes. They were really focused on desktop apps, which is pretty true. And we at Ionic, we saw all this and we're just really frustrated with everything because we thought, I don't want to figure out how to get my JavaScript to run fast, or I don't want to figure out how to get my CSS to work. I just want to be able to write this and get on with it. We had common tools, Jquery. If you've never used Jquery before, you're lying. It basically runs 90% of the web. Backbone, which was my very first framework, and it was okay. You had some good stuff. And then you had frameworks like Angular.js, which now, kind of looking back, it's hard to imagine, but Angular.js was pretty new and still trying to find its footing. When you look at Jquery, it was probably one of the more approachable options because there was a pretty simple ecosystem around it. If you wanted to create some kind of reusable component or some reusable code, they had this really great ecosystem of Jquery plugins, Jquery UI, where you could just add a script tag, add some CSS, run a function, and get all the UI and all the interactions for free. Angular came along, and when we found it, we kind of fell in love with their directives, basically just isolating everything as custom tags, and we never looked back afterwards, and we kind of thought, who's Jquery? Now, fast forward to 2017 and what the browsers and JavaScript hope to offer in the future, the ecosystem has changed quite a bit. We have Angular, now version 2, version 4, and then version 5 will be released in a couple of weeks. And if you didn't get the pause joke in there, there is no Angular 3. We have frameworks or not even frameworks, but libraries like Preact and React, basically showing us that if you just focus on the smaller portions, like the view layer, you can actually get pretty far. But we're only going to count React 16 and up. Everything before that didn't exist. Ember. I don't really use Ember. Is Alex around? If not, ask him. He does more of the Ember stuff. But Ember's still around. People are very happy with it. People use it. And then Vue.js takes a pretty different approach to everything, where it's very middle of the road as far as I don't need a huge monolithic framework, or I need something a little bit more than just what React or Preact offers. And all these options are really good. If you see Flame Wars start saying, oh, framework X is better than framework Y, tell them to shut up. It's kind of annoying to see all this stuff. All these frameworks have their use cases. All of them are excellent. Don't go into Flame Wars. But all these frameworks still offer a different API for every single time you want to write something. Component authoring is not fun because you have to learn all of the different APIs, all the different patterns, all the different tool chains involved with all of them. And every time you want to go ahead and actually use a framework or use a new UI kit for a framework, you have to relearn everything again. Plus, all these frameworks can be pretty big. It's no joke, Angular is kind of big. I love Angular, but it's not a small framework. We're not all going to be Preact and write everything to be crazy small. Ember's still big, and depending on where you are inside of React, it can also be pretty slow. As we start to focus on things like progressive web apps and targeting these really slow connections, all of that really matters. So all of the frameworks and everything, they can really slow you down and bite you. But web components kind of solve most of this. Essentially, it takes all of the nice parts of like a component layer from each of these frameworks and builds it right into the browser. So Chrome supports this, Safari supports this, Edge will support this behind a couple flags in a new creator update. I don't use Firefox, so I think they support everything. But the good part about it is that even if a certain browser doesn't support any of these APIs, it's easy to polyfill. You can provide, there are tons of polyfills out there that can actually support certain versions of a browser, and they can all be lazily loaded kind of for free. So, come on, mouse. There we go. So this is a pretty simple example of what an actual web component looks like. If you've seen code that doesn't look like this but claims to be a web component, you probably have seen something like Polymer, which, but I like the actual vanilla API a little bit better. Basically, we have a class called BetterImage, and it actually extends HTML element. We initialize the HTML element, and then we can start setting up some default properties, all using getters and setters. We have some lifecycle hooks for each of the components. So this is your ngView init, or your React component will load, I think is the name. But essentially, we have these lifecycle hooks on destroy, on create, on update, where we can start to build out our component and give it all of its default methods. All this component actually does is take a source and then a fallback image URL, and then set some default width and height. And the actual render function for this is literally a giant template string. So pretty simple. And then when we want to actually use it, we can call custom elements.define, give it our tag name, and then pass it the class reference when we want to use this later on, for it to load later on. So this is pretty simple, pretty nice. It's just missing a lot of features. So if you change any of the actual properties on it, you have to call like a re-render method itself. Like you have to manually do that. It's not built in. So it doesn't have things like reactive data binding. So that way, like I said, once you change something, it'll automatically update. We're still tied to using direct DOM reference, which can be slow. We don't have built-in TypeScript support out of the box. There's no async rendering, JSX, server-side rendering, pre-compilation of all the templates. If any of those things matter to you, they all do not come out of the box with vanilla web components. You'd have to manually add that process. So we at Ionic did just that and packaged it up into this pretty cool tool that we like to think of called Stencil. Now, Stencil itself is not a framework, 100% not a framework. Don't ever call it a framework. But it is itself a build time API. When we go, I'll show a quick example of it later on to kind of clear that out. But the only references to Stencil APIs exists when you're authoring the component at edit time, and then once it runs through the build chain, it's vanilla web components throughout. And instead of just creating our own kind of best practices or our own concepts, we borrow a lot of ideas from different frameworks. So decorators from Angular, JSX from React, having properties be defined as functions from Vue, so pretty nice things. And again, it is not a framework. It's really frustrating to try to get this point through because we're not 100% sure. Say, oh, it's a compiler. That sounds more confusing. Oh, it's a framework. No, it's a build time API. It seems a little bit simpler. So we have a few starters already created to kind of go over this. So let's actually change display settings on the fly. This is going so much smoother than I thought it would. Too much? Too big?
No, it's good. I just mean you just fix yourself. Yeah.
I know, right?
You're tempting the demo gods right now.
I've made my sacrifice this morning.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah. So this itself, and it actually centered perfectly. What? No imports or anything. So this is essentially our base stencil component, where we have this @component decorator. So if you're not familiar with decorators, they're pretty simple to explain, but under the hood, they're actually quite complex. Essentially, we're just taking our class and saying it is going to be of a type of component. It's going to have some properties called tag and style URL, which can be defined to either files, strings, objects, whatever we want. But essentially, we're just saying this class of my name is going to be registered to a tag or a HTML tag called my name. And then we have a reference to some CSS, or in this case, some Sass, that will be bundled with it at build time. We don't really need to think about that too much. We have our class again, and then we have this main render function. So if you've ever done anything inside of React, this should feel very familiar. Instead of returning actual HTML, we return JSX. So JavaScript representation of all the DOM we want to create and render out. And then we can have some bindings using our open curlies and closing curlies. So quick way, if you guys have never seen this before, we can just think of that as being JavaScript template kind of interpolation, just without the $sign. So pretty straightforward. And we get references to things like the property of last inside of our class, this inside of our class, pretty straightforward. But because it's a TypeScript, we can get some really nice code completion, code hints, all the nice things. So if I want to say on click, or on double click, on click capture, we can get all of that TypeScript references built right in because it's just JavaScript. Now this first and last property actually are defined up here using these @prop decorators. And if you're curious about what the colon string is, it's just TypeScript doing saying that these are strings. If you give me anything else, it'll throw an error. So don't worry about them too much. But the @prop decorator will essentially say, here are two class members. I want these exposed on the element itself. So if we actually look at the implementation of this, we have my name, and actually scroll up a little bit. There we go. We'll say my name is a tag. It'll have a property of first, direct map back to our class. It'll be stencil, last name, again, direct reference to the class member, and set it to JS. So if we actually run our dev server, hello, my name is Stencil.js. Pretty fast. We'll actually go back, update this real quick because the update is crazy fast, at least in my opinion. The fact that it's all doing browser APIs and not having to transpile anything down from some abstract DSL to whatever a browser can read means that it can be transpiled and compiled pretty quickly, but also produces less code. So if we actually open up our dev tools, we have, again, a library load script. We have our kind of core polyfills, basically just saying, hey, if you're in a browser that doesn't support web components, here's how we can polyfill it. Here is our actual code to render out a component. It's 39 lines, and that's with comments and kind of weird module ID things. But we have this really nice, concise, at least in my opinion, component that doesn't require any external dependencies, is built right into the browser, and can run and be loaded rather quickly. Yeah, basically all of it. And this is just registering the namespace for it. We don't have to worry about that part. So yeah, that's pretty much all the code. 19 lines to actually create a small component that runs natively in the browser. Pretty awesome. Yes. That worked. Awesome. Okay. So we saw 2 decorators for this, but this is essentially the entire API for the Stencil build time. There's not a lot to it, and we wanted to keep it pretty small and pretty easy to understand, so that way you're not having to relearn all these new concepts and all these new ideas. But essentially, component, it basically defines a class as a web component. At prop will expose any class members as element properties. At state, we're still debating this one internally, but at state is a way to have some kind of mechanism to cause a re-render, but not expose something to a user. We'll close alerts. Events are for quick ways to emit custom events. So if you, Angular has a similar fashion called outputs. Event just sounds like a cleaner way. Listen for setting up event listeners, so you can actually trigger functions inside the class. And then when all else fails and you want to get a direct reference to your component in the DOM, you can get that with @element. So pretty straightforward. So this can make you think, well, there's not a lot there, and it's just built on other frameworks. Why not just use those other frameworks? And we really thought about this, and we want to address a lot of issues that we saw with every JavaScript framework, mainly performance. If you have an app and you're trying to load it on a really old phone, and in terms of progressive web apps, trying to load it over kind of slow 3G, none of these frameworks actually cut it. Your time to interactive is 5 seconds and higher. And if your app doesn't load within a second, people are going to just abandon it and say, oh, it's broke, close, go on to the next thing. Because of all of these APIs being in the browser and being native, they can get pretty fast and load very quickly. Stability was another thing we also wanted to address. If anyone got burnt by the Angular 2 upgrade, where it's essentially a whole new framework, we feel your pain. But who's to say that none of these other frameworks could do it? Granted, Ember basically says, oh, we're never going to break anything. But they can't guarantee that. Same thing with React, same thing with Preact. The fact that all of these are in the browsers mean that many people have sat in a room to define these APIs and have them in the browser, and they're here to stay. Even the older implementations, they'll be here well into iOS 15. And then interoperability. Try saying that 5 times fast. So interop. All of these components, because they're just regular JavaScript and not tied to a particular framework, can be used anywhere. So if you're using an Angular app, you can bring in all these components and it'll just work. If you want to use them inside of a React app, you can write your own components and it'll just work. So if you are a UI author and you don't want to write a new component library for every new framework that exists, this could be for you. If you're at a large company where there are several teams and you have an internal design language, but you actually want to share those components and not have to re-implement them, this is also for you. If you happen to work for Ionic, this is also for you. So that's only me. But again, app developers, if you care about having a fast experience on your device, and for your users who, iPhone 6, starting to show its age, Nexus 5, Moto G, like all these older devices, this is perfect. So if you are looking for some more information, Stencil.js itself is a Stencil project. It is an entire website built with Stencil components, where we have all of our documentation going over all the components, all the APIs, kind of diving deep into some of the logic behind things. This will be one of the few things that I actually like to show. This is a performance demo. React actually did a pretty awesome demonstration of their asynchronous rendering engine. We thought, can we do the same thing with just web components? Turns out you can. Where we have all of this rendering asynchronously, updating all the data bindings, and animating things at the same exact time. All web components. This is just the raw part of it. Pretty minimal code for it. Again, this is all compiled. Nothing overly crazy. But it's super smooth, super fast, and even if this is a projection, loading it on your phone, it's even faster. We have, all of these are links anyway, so when I tweet out the actual slides, you'll get to see all this. We have a really awesome person who found Stencil like day 2 of it being open, and they actually took a look and wrote some pretty nice words about why web components will be awesome. And then kind of setting the stage for what are we going to do next. We're maybe a web component kind of Redux-like setup. Instead of having to reinvent your state management using Redux or some kind of internal pattern, you could define it all as a component. We don't know. We think it may be cool. State management is probably going to be the next big thing in JavaScript. And then if you actually do build something with it or have questions, tweet at me, but also reach out Stencil.js on Twitter. And then I want to see this badge actually take off because I figured out how to actually embed the logo inside of shields.io as a base64 string. So the URL for this is super crazy big, but the fact that I can do it, I want to see this take off. So yeah, thank you. Stencil.js.com if you have any other questions. But thanks.